would like to start with the background of the conflict, and I'm going to concentrate on the general conflict rather than concentrate on Nuer only. The conflict in Sudan started way back in 1955. The SPLA started another round of armed struggle, which was ended in 2005 by the Sudan Peace Agreement, which is largely known as CPA, or Comprehensive Peace Agreement, that was signed between the government of Sudan and the SPLA, the armed movement that fought in Sudan for liberation of the country for 21 years. The armed struggle that was fought for 21 years, up to 2.5 million or more has perished in the war. There was a huge displacement as well, internally and externally. The sign of Comprehensive Peace Agreement brought a lot of hope to people of Sudan, and particularly to people of Nuer. They were subject to backwardness, poverty, hunger for several years. Nuers live in the currently three states: Jonglei, Upper Nile, and the Western Upper Nile. Because of the proximity to the border with Ethiopia, has been used by all the Southern Sudanese to access Ethiopia and by the SPLA when accessing the front or coming back from the training to go and fight in South Sudan. That had gone on for many years, and that has exhausted resources, subject the people of Upper Nile, or Nuer in particular the Nuer East Band of the Nile, which are known as Kimunguyi, were very much involved in the struggle that was related between the SPLM and Anyanya II by then, and that created insecurity and hoping for war. Also, the unemployment, the poverty also encouraged many youths to practice the huge part of the conflict in Nuer land and South Sudan. And there are so many reasons why the CPA was not implemented either on time or not implemented at all at certain protocols. One of them was that one other major party to the conflict, which is the NCP, was not willing and has no political will to implement the CPA. They have created a lot of obstacles and sabotaged the implementations. Number two, it has also been recognized that the international community were unable to make available the resources or the money that were pledged for the development or to support the fees import in South Sudan. Without the funding necessary for creating projects that will bring about harmony and stability, the peace is not going to last. Number three, which is also one of the major, is that the government of South Sudan, which came into existence after the signing of Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005, is a young government and has been overwhelmed by the responsibility of transition from war to peace, and also the structure that is necessary for the government to function properly. And that's actually a situation that made a lot of things aggravating, including the disarmament. The government of South Sudan has tried to curb intercommunal conflicts and also the corruptions within the system, but without success. With the GPA under the implementation as well, there is still some pocket of intercommunal or tribal conflict within the region. After the conflicts, there has been an effort of reconciliations and peace. That they try hard in making sure that the peace come back to Nuer land. They mobilize resources, NGOs from international community and from the local community to make sure that peace exists in Nuer land. In 1994, there was a well-known Akobo Peace Conference that was made after the conflict between Nuer and Law Nuer, of Nasser and Akoba. There was another important peace agreement conducted in Kenya in Nairobi, or in Logichoga, I mean. That was agreement of peace conference between the Nuer and Denka, June 2nd to 10th, 1998. There is also a well-known peace agreement that was conducted or held in 1999, which was between Denka and Nuer of Western Nile, which is actually known as Denka Nuer West Bank Peace and Reconciliations Conference, held in Woodley from February 27th to 8th May 1999. There's also another one, the Law Nuer and Anuak Peace and Reconciliation Conference, held in Akoba town between March 21st to 25th in 2005. That peace agreement included Anuak, Denka, Jir, Kashifo, Morle, Nuer, and I would also want to mention some of the commonality of those peace agreements. Most of the peace agreements that I just mentioned above were conducted, and the participants were from the local traditional chiefs, the youth group, women groups, church leaders, military groups, political leaders, as well as observers from the international community. One of the major outcomes for this peace agreement was also that all those conferences provide a very good forum for face-to-face discussions between the participants. It gives a chance for participants to narrate the events that brought about the conflict and also the events that occurred during the conflicts. And finally, sometimes they reach an agreement, most of those peace accords. Number three, those peace agreements brought together in the group who are known traditionally to be hostile to each other, who are neighbors, and their relationships was also made even worse by the conflicts. The civil war that raged from 1955 up to the last one. The grassroots conference addressed disputes. People come together to address the cause of disputes, which is mostly the ownership of land, the access to the animal grazing lands, the water points. Also, some of them discuss the return of the abducted children. Like I believe the one that the number 5, which is the East Bank Nilotic Peace, people-to-people peace agreement. They also try to address the issue of cattle raiding, one of the major issues that made the local conflicts to escalate. Even now, if people, sometimes certain group will come together, make peace, but eventually the cattle raiders, which are the gang of youth, will go out and raid the cattle. The same way, the other group will go from the other side and also go and raid cattle and vice versa. Even though there's the standing agreement that no cattle raiding to happen during this time. Most of all the peace agreements or the peace initiatives or the conferences end in a certain agreement. They all end with the signing of a document that we have to be abide by this and this and this and this and so on. Number 6, all the peace conferences that were conducted were initiated and organized by Sudan Council of Change, as I mentioned before, with the support of international community, particularly the international churches. Number 7, all the grassroots peace conferences suffer from lack of proper monitoring mechanism and follow-up. That's one of the major problems. Southern Sudan area is equivalent, if you can compare, is equivalent to Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi. All these countries, if you put them together, they are equal to the size of Southern Sudan. How do we go from here? I would like to share with you some of my ideas. Recently, the government of this country, the government of Australia, has pledged $140 million to Africa, and Sudan, and South Sudan in particular, is included. That brought the importance of South Sudan to Australia as well. Why don't we have a group that would work between South Sudan and Australia. And I would like to call it Sudanese or South Sudanese Australian Solidarity Group. The group will be responsible for soliciting funds or getting donations from whoever, and also it will allow Australians, I would say from here the white Australians who are involved in that particular group, to go visit Sudan and bring back what's happening in Sudan. There are about 35,000 Sudanese who are living in this country, calling Australia their home. Why don't we start from here? What was demonstrated by government of Australia is an interest. Also the community, that has to also be taken up at the level. So I would propose that a group under the name Sudanese Australian Solidarity Group.
That since the end of the Cold War, African countries have increasingly become aware of the fact that development would be hindered so long as the atmosphere of lasting peace and stability did not prevail. And in the 1990s, there was a general lack of interest, or rather a withdrawal by the external actors in Africa. Okay? And also, when everyone looked at the international organizations that were prevalent at that particular time, for example, the Organization of African Unity, they were unable, they had a general inability to address professional conflicts effectively. That tends to continue up to today. At continental level, political transformation is taking place, and in fact, commitments, especially the ones that were also exemplified by the transition of the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. The African Union has played a role in setting pace towards the creation of what I call or what is called generally a peace or a new peace and security architecture in Africa. Peace and security has actually been reaffirmed as one of the main objectives of the African Union. When I talk about, or when we talk about the African peace and security architecture, we refer to a set of structures that have been implemented within the African Union. Briefly about the Peace and Security Council. It is a standing decision-making organ for prevention and management and resolution of conflicts, and a kind of collective security and early warning arrangement to facilitate timely and efficient response to conflict and crisis situations, with respect to human rights and fundamental freedoms, and also reinforcing international humanitarian law. It is supported by the African Union Commission in the framework of various structures. There is a panel of the worries, I think, a continental worried early warning system is also envisaged, it's also underway perhaps. African standby forces, which are supposed to be organized and framed within also the mechanism of the sub-regional organizations. When it comes to the question of sub-regional organization, it's important that they've been identified to be central in the evolving framework of the peace and security structure. Now, briefly about some of the records, the record of peacekeeping operations in Africa in relation to the regional organizations of the continental framework, that's the OAU and the African Union. Well, if we get back, we see that the OAU, of course, did have less, in fact, ceasefire, less complex ceasefire monitoring missions. Now, when you look at that kind of history of the existence of the OAU from the beginning, that's post-1963, then coming down to up to the end, to the 1990s, you see that it's a long one. And when you look at the various conflicts that existed on the continent, we can see that this kind of record is not very good at all. However, when the African Union came in, we can see that there is a different way or a different approach to going about it, and it has undertaken and carried out, in fact, more within this short time period, more peace and security operations, peacekeeping operations. What are the various challenges that the African peace and security architecture might face? The question of funding, the idea of inadequate funding. I think two honourables who spoke before me have also highlighted this as a big problem. The question of lacking capacities in planning and conducting the peace and security related operations is also another one. Issues of early warning systems, for example. So from a continental perspective, and not only, also a regional. There were very many cases where you can see that there is a possibility, there are symptoms that there could be there's a conflict that could potentially lead to escalation, but then the problem is that no reactions have actually taken place. So this is indeed an important precedent. Now, political leverage is also another problem. Actually, results in uncertain political support from the member states of the African Union or the Continent Organization that have actually led to undermining peace and security initiatives. And the African Union has also heavily relied on the international community in brokering a peace agreement in the Darfur crisis. Now, when it comes to the EU, there are many things that we can talk about. There is a partnership agreement between the EU and the African, Pacific, and Caribbean countries. And this agreement is a recent development because it has put various conditions for accessing EU money and EU's involvement, sponsors various projects, in the line of promoting peace and security, preventing and also managing violent conflicts. Accessing EU money here is based on conditions, it's conditionalized. In fact, Sudan, for example, has not ratified the Cotonou agreement yet. The second one is a mechanism that was adopted, that's a strategy for Africa, which was adopted in 2005. And this was, in fact, reinforced as a joint EU-Africa strategy in 2007, with an objective of setting out a strategic and coherent European partnership in the entire African continent. Various actions have also taken place in this regard, including a concept for strengthening African capabilities for the prevention and management management and resolution of conflict, and very importantly is the Africa Peace Facility. And in terms of the issue of resources, this facility has been very, very integral in addressing some of the recent missions that have taken place on the continent. The Peace Facility was established in 2004. Its aim was to support Africa-led peace support operations. Apart from just that facility alone, in general, the EU has been involved in operating various conflict areas on the ground. Also, it got involved in supporting the United Nations model process of elections. It was in 2006. Also, the police mission was further set to support the establishment of Congolese unit, Congolese unit here. Now, lastly, another area that could be identified is a travel sport at the heart of my research at the moment at the Global Terrorism Research Center, and that's the mission in Somalia, where we've seen support to the African Union's mission to the country with various contributions, both at EU level and also from various member states of the Union. On the ground in Africa, we tend to see a lot of resources being declared, allocated, etc. It is indeed a question whether those resources get to the people and they target exactly, they meet the objectives that they're supposed to do. That effectiveness is also is important. There is also another critical question, and that's the nature of international engagement itself. That is, one, there's extreme rivalry, on the continent, so that's my last question, perhaps it would be good to be discussed here. And Sudan is also an area here where we can see that. I'm thinking about China, the Chinese engagement in southern Sudan. They're hungry, they're thirsty, and they're up for resources, and what kinds of relationships that they have with their with the elites in the Sudan, and to what extent can that contribute towards achieving peace in the southern region. Thank you very much.
Point then that I want to talk about is this, what I call the marginalisation of the economic dimensions of conflict in a lot of these post-conflict accountability mechanisms. This can happen in a few ways, or it has happened in a few ways to date. Firstly, we've seen that international institutions and war crimes trials and truth and reconciliation commissions have to date largely ignored large-scale economic crimes. So you may be aware that the focus of those kinds of organisations have traditionally or largely been a genocide, crimes against humanity, that those are limited to certain types of conduct, and generally doesn't include economic crimes against humanity, and of course war crimes. The only crime substantively within international criminal law that really goes directly to economic matters is the crime of pillage. So we have one crime really that might be applied to economic crimes. The second way that we've seen the economic dimensions of conflict getting ignored, I think, is through the failure to address the role of industry in international crimes. And that's really happened in a couple of ways. Firstly, you may be aware that most Truth and Reconciliation Commissions don't look at business actors, and certainly most war crimes trials to date haven't, in a systematic way, addressed the role of individuals in the business world in the conduct of international crimes. It hasn't really been a feature of the prosecutorial policies of any of those courts or of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions since Nuremberg. A number of the key cases were against industrialists. This was a very important component of what Nuremberg was meant to be about. Part of the mandate of the Liberian Truth and Reconciliation Commission was specifically to investigate economic crimes and how that played a role in the Liberian conflict. And in particular, this included looking at the exploitation of natural public resources to perpetuate the conflict in Liberia, to determine whether these were isolated incidents or part of a systematic pattern, to establish whether and what the causes, the circumstances, and the contexts of these economic violations were, and to look at who was responsible for them. And the businesses that were looked at were not only, of course, local businesses, but quite often involved foreign individuals in the business world and large multinational corporations from from various different parts of the world operating in Liberia. And the court, or the commission rather, in doing that work, had to come up effectively with a definition of economic crime. They defined economic crime as any prohibited activity committed for the purpose of generating economic gains, or that in fact generates economic gains. It is taken to apply to any state or non-state actor with a link to the conflict in Liberia, including public and private individuals, including corporations and other business entities that contributed to the human rights violations or the humanitarian law violations, and that otherwise perpetuated the conflict or benefited economically from the conflict. That an economic crime is essentially one that violates the economic rights of the state, of its citizens, or that obstructs the economic development or policy of the state. It seems that in some conflicts it is important to look at the economic dimensions of the conflict and economic actors who were involved. And that the failure to do so to date is somewhat at odds with the central significance that economics has in many conflicts. Studies have shown that natural resources and markets for natural resources have a very significant impact on the propensity for conflict in a country, for the duration of the conflict and for its intensity, and in particular can have a very big role in civil wars. And so, for example, statistics have been given that a country that's dependent on oil and mineral resources has a 23% risk of civil war for any 5-year period, given that of a comparable non-resource dependent country is only 0.5%. So there's a very large discrepancy between the propensity for conflict. Revenue from resource production can finance the increasing upgrading of war, for example, that it can generate a political economy that's dominated by a contest to control resource rents or rent seeking, which can lead to corruption and violence, for example. The report of the Liberian Truth and Reconciliation Commission describes the very integral role that various different industries played for the perpetuation of the conflict in Liberia. For example, a patronage system that really got set up whereby there was corruption in the logging, mining and telecommunications industries, for example, that led to really enormous tax evasion taking place, that led to arms trafficking via and through multinational corporation involvement, in violation often of the UN Security Council resolutions. There are, of course, a few ways that you could integrate the economic dimensions of conflict into the truth-telling processes that are adopted by a community and the accountability processes, and I guess I've really indicated what those are. One is to expand the mandate of organisations and institutions that are set up for that purpose, and to not be limited by what has been the traditional focus of these institutions. And I think that the example of the Liberian Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a great example of how that mandate can be shifted if it's appropriate for the local community to see that story told and to see accountability. Another thing that could be considered is the bringing of actions directly against corporate entities and not simply individuals in the business world. The third way is, of course, to integrate it into Truth and Reconciliation Commission processes also. By including economic crimes like, for example, wide-scale corruption and wide-scale plunder, is that it allows the myth of a clean dictatorship to be shattered. And this seems to be important for truth-telling and for narrative building and the creation of a durable peace. Vast social inequality, economic mismanagement and economic abuse by elites were a driving force in the underlying conflicts in many of the Latin American countries that led to their transition from authoritarian to democratic rule in the 1980s and the 1990s. But despite this, all of the commissions that were set up to tell the story of what had occurred systematically failed to consider economic crimes like corruption. And as a result, they take the view that these mechanisms have failed to demythologise what is in fact a very popular belief in those countries, that corruption is a feature of democracy and not of dictatorship. A second argument that's been given in favour of including economic crimes and economic actors in transitional justice accountability is that to fail to do so can reduce the local legitimacy of those mechanisms. Corruption ought to be a principal subject of transitional justice discourse and practice, because of the key role that poverty and socio-economic inequalities have played in some of the conflicts. And the failure to do this, they argue, works against a sense of the local community developing an ownership of those processes, of those mechanisms. Rather, the processes take the form or the impression, give the impression of simply being imposed from without by the international community, not paying attention to the requirements on the ground. In addition, it's been argued, of course, that failing to address the economic causes of war and the economic crimes in war can result in the conditions that gave rise to the conflict in the first instance going unattended, so going unaddressed. And it might continue to foster the kinds of grievances that might see a re-emergence in the conflict. The failure to address economic crimes of elites can assist them in evading justice in respect of other violations, human rights violations and humanitarian law violations, and can be counterproductive to the goal to end impunity that may come at some point in a community's transition from war to peace. The economic impunity of these groups of people can reinforce impunity for other kinds of violations that they have committed. Reparations are essentially funds that can be obtained that have been ill-gotten funds obtained through the commission of recognised crimes, and that can be utilised to certain purposes. It might be to compensate victims, it may be to go towards development projects and reconstruction processes. The burden of that kind of economic restoration and reparation after war should fall as far as possible on the war supporters and the profiteers of war. And he points, for example, to exactly why the Farben Corporation was targeted in the Nuremberg trials in Nazi Germany.
Civil war in East Timor in about the middle August 1975, and then, as I mentioned, Indonesia invaded in December 1975, and it occupied East Timor until 1999, when there was an act of self-determination, usually referred to as the popular consultation, a ballot or a referendum similar to the one I understand you are expecting in South Sudan. Security at that point was left in the hands of the Indonesian military. In other words, the foxes looked after the chickens, and that's where things went badly wrong. However, the act of self-determination was successfully conducted. Close to 78% of Timorese voted, despite intimidation and despite great fear about the possibility of revenge or payback by the Indonesian military. Many violations of human rights were conducted in East Timor, perpetrated in East Timor between 1975, the Civil War period, and the beginning of the Indonesian occupation until Indonesia left late 99. The issue facing the incoming Timor, the UN, which was the first government, if you like, the transitional government, and the East Timorese government was what we're going to do about the enormous amount of suffering, the numerous victims, the violations committed in 1999, only a few months before they took over, and during the previous 24 years. The Truth Commission, to jump ahead, concluded that the crimes committed in East Timor during the period 75 to 99 amounted to crimes against humanity and war crimes. The right of the people of East Timor to self-determination had not been respected by Indonesia, though it was a member of the UN and was committed in its constitution to supporting self-determination for decolonising peoples. Many countries in Africa supported the right of the East Timorese at the UN. The majority of the votes were held in favour of self-determination because of support from Africa. There was no similar support from my country, Australia, from the US, from most of Europe with the exception of Portugal. The political corruption of governments that allowed the massive violations that we documented in the CAVR report to happen, and they should also be held accountable for what they did. That has not happened, even though we tabled our report 4 years ago at the end of 2005. So there's been nothing here in Australia, nothing in Washington, nothing in London, nothing in Geneva, and in fact even nothing within the Security Council in New York. East Timor set up a reconciliation commission, the CAVR, led by 7 East Timorese commissioners, operated for 4 years, and it was established following a decision by the resistance movement. This idea came out of the resistance umbrella, all the various factions and parties that finally got their act together, particularly culminating in '99, and said, we have got to do something to rebuild national unity, to piece together the torn fabric of our society, and one way to do that is a process of reconciliation. CAVR, it's the first reconciliation commission of its kind in this part of the world. This sort of thing has not been done before in Asia or the Pacific. As a result, we took a lot of advice from colleagues in South Africa, and we spent a lot of time looking at models in Latin America, which Joanna referred to. But at the end of the day, I'd say we came up with 3 really key things. One was, it was really critical that this project, this reconciliation project, had the strongest and broadest possible support right across East Timorese society, including those that knew that their dirty linen would probably be exposed and hung out on the line for people to see. And we ended up with terrific support from the historic parties that formed in 1975, from the church, from civil society, victims. We devoted a lot of time to intensive consultation. Most East Timorese couldn't give a stuff about justice. Justice for them was Portuguese justice, Indonesian justice. It was actually something that made them suffer more. They had no respect for the law because they didn't have any role in making the law or in administering it, and it always favoured those in power or those in positions of authority they knew. So we needed to spend a lot of time in the field talking to people, and East Timor has many languages. This all had to be done in several languages, and of course there had to be a very intensive training of East Timorese colleagues so that they understood all this and they could explain it and not create even more problems by getting it all mixed up, and the whole thing would end up a disaster. Secondly, anyway, we operated independently. It was very important that we were seen, the Truth Commission, the Reconciliation Commission, CAVR, was seen to be independent. It was not representing even the people who voted for independence, the 78% who voted for independence in '99. Nor was it representing the 22% who voted the other way, or any of the political parties. Thirdly, we tried to make the Reconciliation Commission, even though it was new in East Timor, in this part of the world, appropriate to East Timor. So we used local languages, we used a lot of indigenous culture and indigenous reconciliation processes in our mechanisms, and as I said, we had Timorese leadership. So it was not, though we learned from international experiences, this was not a carbon copy or a clone of any other reconciliation commission. We used the old prison in Dili as our headquarters, as a symbol of the rehabilitation of East Timor and as a symbol of the transformation of East Timor from a very horrible past to a more hopeful and positive future. So we're trying to turn negatives into positives, and this was a symbolic way of doing it. And even though people were a bit uncertain about it to begin with, because they had a strong sense of the supernatural and they believed this place is full of ghosts and terrible vibes, it turned out to be a brilliant stroke of planning. We did three things. We facilitated community reconciliation. We were asked to establish the truth about what happened between 74 and 99. And thirdly, to write it all up. So we tried to do too much, I think. So keep it manageable, keep it achievable, and you probably have to make hard decisions if you're going to add those 2 extra terms of reference into the objectives of such a body. A key point to make about East Timor is that all these terrible crimes, were we going to allow murderers and rapists and commanding officers to go through this milder process? And the decision was, no, we are not. So we split the crimes into 2 categories. Serious crimes, murder, rape, torture, command responsibility, and less serious crimes, all the rest. The serious crimes went to the serious crimes process set up and run by the UN. And that was a conventional court process. And there were some people in jail in Timor as a result of that process. The less serious crimes were all given to the CAVR Commission. So it's a very interesting way of dividing up the work so that it could be managed. We did 1,400 cases of less serious crimes, and we only did 99. We simply didn't have the time or the resources to do 98, 97, all the way back to 75. So we made very difficult decisions. The process was voluntary and it was based on education. We spent 3 months in each sub-district explaining to people how this would work, the challenges it would present, but also the benefits it would present to the perpetrators and to their communities. The perpetrators had to make a full confession in writing, and that had to be vetted by the official Prosecutor General. And only after the Prosecutor General said it's not a serious crime, CAVR can deal with it, did we go ahead with the case. Then we met with the local community and briefed them on the whole thing and prepared them. And the community reconciliation ceremonies were held in that locality. We held them in riverbeds, under banyan trees, in old buildings, very much in the local community. And I want to stress that I think one reason why the whole thing worked so well is because we involved the local community, and as far as possible we tried to use processes familiar to them, and even to include traditional elders. The Honourable James made several mentions to the role of kings, traditional elders, traditional leaders, etc. in the new South Sudan. We tried to incorporate that in our process as well, so that people understood that a perpetrator, usually young men, had to satisfy the community that they were genuinely sorry, they would not re-offend, and they would be constructive members of the community in the future. If that worked out, they were invited to sit on what we call the bitty bot, the big mat, and they were given a penalty, a sanction, usually fairly light, and received back into the community, hence the title of the organisation, the Commission for Reception back into the community, Truth and Reconciliation. Continue. Big stress on women being sitting in the panels, being able to tell their stories, being able to question perpetrators and establish they were telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Then, of course, we wrote it all down. Timor's an oral society. People don't write much, don't read much, but for historical, teaching, educative and criminal prosecutorial purposes, it was very important that it get written up. So we've spent a lot of time archiving all the material.